My mother used to say a scale doesn't lie, it just waits for you to read it right. I kept her brass kitchen scale on the shelf above my own stove for 11 years after she passed, still dusted with flour some mornings if I looked close enough. She'd weighed out flour on it for the pantry she ran out of a converted garage on Willowbend Street in Dayton, Ohio, feeding whoever showed up hungry on a Tuesday. No questions, no forms. I was 44 years old, divorced, and I worked the inventory floor at Redline Freight and Distribution, third shift, counting pallets under fluorescent lights that hum just a little too loud. Before Redline, I'd been a payroll bookkeeper for 19 years at a plant that closed in 2019. I never stopped keeping records. I carried a small spiral notebook in my back pocket and logged every discrepancy I found on the floor. Out of habit more than anything, the same way my mother used to write down every pound of flour that left her pantry. Zarek Dunmore had been my shift supervisor for 2 years. He wasn't a monster in the beginning. The first winter I worked under him, my car wouldn't start in the Redline lot at midnight, and he sat with me for 40 minutes waiting on a jump, telling bad jokes about his ex-wife's cooking until the tow truck showed. That's the man I trusted. That's the man who let me believe I mattered to him. I never thought twice about the freight numbers not matching some nights. Pallet here, a case there. Redline moved thousands of units a week through that dock. Discrepancies happened. Until the night in March when Zarek stood in front of the entire loading crew and told them I'd been falsifying the count sheets. He didn't ask me quietly. He didn't pull me into his office. He said it loud enough for every scanner and every rolling cart to stop, loud enough that Sawyer Bennett, who'd worked the dock beside me for 6 years, dropped a case of bottled water she was holding. I should have noticed sooner. I tell myself that some nights, though my mother would have told me not to be so hard on myself. The first sign came in January. A pallet of paper goods logged in at 40 cases, counted out at 36. I mentioned it to Zarek in passing the way you'd mention a light bulb burning out. He laughed it off, said the vendor probably shorted us, said he'd handle it himself so I didn't need to file a discrepancy report. I didn't think anything of it. He handled things. That was who he was to me. The second sign came in February. I was closing out the night's manifest when I noticed a truck listed as inbound that never showed on the dock camera log. I asked the new kid on the crew, a 19-year-old named Marek Voss, if he'd seen it come through. He said Zarek had told him to mark it received before it even arrived, said it was just paperwork timing. Nothing to worry about. I filed that one away in my notebook. Not because I suspected him of anything. Because that's what I do. I write things down. The third sign was smaller than the others, and it's the one that still sits with me. Zarek stopped assigning me to close out the manifests alone. Said he wanted to lighten my load. Started pairing me with Marek instead, or doing the closing count himself. For 6 weeks after that, things got better. Zarek put in for a raise on my behalf that actually went through. He covered my shift the week my sister had surgery in Columbus without me even asking twice. He told the regional director, a woman named Vladlena Kessler, that I was the most reliable clerk on his floor. I let my guard down. I stopped checking the manifests as closely. I told myself the discrepancies in January and February had been nothing, vendor error, paperwork timing, exactly what he'd said. You know that feeling when someone hands you back a little bit of trust, and you hand them the rest of it too, just to be done carrying it alone? That's where I was in early March. Grateful. Settled. Sure that whatever I'd sensed in January had just been me being tired, being too careful, the way my mother taught me to be. I didn't know it yet, but the numbers hadn't stopped disappearing. They just stopped disappearing where I was looking. It was a Thursday in March, 11:40 on the dock clock, and the whole crew was there for shift change. Zarek stood by the scanner station holding a printed count sheet, my initials at the bottom of it, and he said I'd been falsifying inventory for months. Said the numbers proved it. Said corporate would be reviewing my file by Monday. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I asked to see the count sheet. He held it up but wouldn't hand it over. I noticed the date stamp in the corner was wrong. Printed 2 days after the shift it claimed to document. My mother taught me to notice things like that. She used to say a scale doesn't lie, it just waits for you to read it right, and standing there under those buzzing lights I read it. I said nothing more that night. I went home. I didn't cry. I sat at my kitchen table with my mother's brass scale on the shelf above the stove, and I opened my notebook and I started going back through 6 months of my own logged discrepancies, side by side with the official manifests. That's when I found the pattern. Every discrepancy I'd noted, every one Zarek had waved off as vendor error or paperwork timing, matched a resale listing. I'd seen the listings before without registering them: second-hand freight equipment and overstock goods, posted under a username I recognized because Marek had mentioned it once in passing, a joke about his supervisor's side hustle. I opened my laptop at 1 a.m. and searched the username. 41 listings over 8 months. Pallet jacks, sealed cases of goods, exactly the items and exactly the quantities missing from my logs. I sat very still for a long time after that. I did not call anyone that night. Some things need to sit before you touch them again. By the following Tuesday, I had every discrepancy from my notebook cross-referenced against every listing, printed and dated and organized the way I used to organize payroll files 19 years ago. I photographed each listing before it could be taken down. I made 3 copies of everything and mailed one to myself unopened the way an old coworker once told me lawyers do it. You know that feeling when you've been explaining yourself to someone who already decided not to understand you? I stopped needing him to understand. I just needed the truth to be undeniable. 2 days after I found the listings, I brought my notebook and the copies to Willowbend Street, to the pantry my mother built out of a converted garage, the one Sawyer had started volunteering at with me on weekends since her own mother passed. I hadn't told Sawyer what happened at work yet. I just needed to sit somewhere that still smelled like flour. Sawyer found me at the folding table in the back, my papers spread out in front of me instead of the donation forms we were supposed to be sorting. She didn't ask what was wrong right away. She just sat down across from me and waited the way my mother used to wait for people before they were ready to talk. When I finally told her everything, Sawyer went quiet for a moment, then reached into her canvas bag and pulled out her phone. She said she'd seen something too. A voicemail Zarek left her by accident in February, meant for someone else, where he mentioned moving the Tuesday pallet before anyone counts it twice. She'd saved it without knowing why. She said something in her gut told her not to delete it. That's the moment I understood I hadn't been carrying this alone the whole time. I'd just been too tired to notice who was standing next to me. I need a lawyer, I told her. Someone who'll look at this and tell me if I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing. Sawyer knew a man named Percival Grant, an attorney who'd helped her family with her mother's estate. I called his office the next morning. His voice was steady and plain, no performance in it. I laid everything out in order: the notebook, the listings, the voicemail, the wrongly dated count sheet. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he told me 3 things that rearranged my whole understanding of where I stood. He said the mismatched date stamp alone could unravel Zarek's entire termination case against me. He said the resale evidence, combined with my notebook, could point to a pattern serious enough for corporate and possibly the police. And he said that whatever happened next, I needed to stop confronting anyone alone, starting immediately. I set the phone down on the table after we hung up. I looked at my mother's handwriting on an old pantry ledger sitting nearby, dates and pounds of flour recorded in the same careful hand she'd used my whole childhood. Write it down, she used to tell me. I remembered what she said. Write it down. So I had. Percival Grant called me back 3 days later with a plan instead of just advice. He said we needed more than my notebook and Sawar's voicemail. We needed to know if anyone else had been pushed out the way Zarek was trying to push me out, because a pattern is harder to dismiss than a single complaint. Sawyer remembered a name. A woman named Electo Marsh, who'd worked the day shift until the previous November, fired abruptly over a count discrepancy. Nobody ever fully explained to her. Sawyer had her number still saved from an old crew group chat. I called Electo on a Sunday afternoon. She was hesitant at first, her voice careful in the way people get when they've already been called a liar once and don't want to relive it. But when I told her what I'd found, the resale listings, the mismatched dates, something in her went quiet on the other end of the line. She said she'd been let go the same way. Publicly. Suddenly. No paperwork trail she could ever get access to. She'd been 3 months behind on rent since, working 2 part-time jobs to keep her apartment near the fairgrounds. I didn't feel angry when she told me that. I felt something steadier than anger. I felt certain. You can be patient and still have a limit. I understood that difference for the first time sitting in my kitchen with the phone against my ear. My mother's brass scale catching the porch light through the window. Percival drew up a formal complaint over the following week, built from my notebook, Sawar's voicemail, Electo's statement, and copies of every resale listing I'd photographed before they vanished. He said we had two paths: file quietly through corporate HR and hope it was handled fairly, or request a formal meeting with ownership directly. Given the scope of what we'd found, I chose the second path. Not because I wanted a spectacle, because I had learned, watching my mother run that pantry for 30 years, that quiet problems left in the hands of the people who cause them rarely stay solved. Percival contacted Redline's HR director, a woman named Tierney Hollis, requesting a meeting with both HR and ownership present. Tierney called me herself 2 days later. Her voice was careful, professional, but there was something underneath it that told me she'd already sensed something was wrong on that floor long before I called. She said the owner, a man named Benedict Cole, had specifically asked to be included once he reviewed a preliminary summary of the complaint. She said he'd want to see the evidence himself. I set the meeting for the following Thursday. I didn't sleep well that week. But for the first time in months, it wasn't fear keeping me up. It was the quiet, steady weight of finally being ready. I walked into Redline's corporate office on Thursday morning wearing the same navy cardigan I wear to the pantry on Saturdays. No makeup, no armor, just myself and a folder of paper thick enough that Percival had to bind it with a binder clip the size of my thumb. Tierney met us in the lobby and led us to a conference room on the 3rd floor. Glass walls looking out over the same loading dock where Zarek had said my name in front of everyone. Benedict Cole was already seated at the head of the table when we walked in. A tall man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. A stack of my mailed documents already open in front of him. He didn't say much at first. He asked me to walk him through everything from the beginning, and I did plainly the way my mother taught me to explain things, no more dramatic than the facts required. Zarek was called in 20 minutes later. He walked in already talking, already smiling the same easy smile that once sat beside me for 40 minutes waiting on a tow truck. That smile stayed on his face when he saw me at the table. It stayed on his face when Benedict slid the resale listings across the table toward him. It faltered just slightly when Tierney set Electo Marsh's written statement down beside them. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. His voice was still steady, still practiced. "She's misreading basic inventory variants." Benedict didn't raise his voice. He never did, not once in that whole meeting. He simply turned the mismatched count sheet around so Zarek could see the date stamp himself, printed 2 days after the shift it claimed to document. Zarek's smile did not survive that. I did not gloat. I did not smile back at him the way some small, tired part of me might have wanted to a year earlier. I sat with my hands folded on the table and let the paper speak for itself, the way my mother's ledgers had always spoken for her. Benedict terminated Zarek before the meeting ended, effective immediately, security escorting him from the building within the hour. Tierney informed me that the resale evidence and financial pattern would be turned over to the Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office for review. Benedict personally committed to reinstating both Electo and me, with back pay, and asked what it would take to make sure nothing like this ever happened on his floor again without someone noticing sooner. I told him the truth. Listen to the people who write things down. They're usually the first ones to see it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if I'd be willing to help build a new internal reporting process, one that didn't depend on a supervisor's word alone. I said yes. Electo Marsh came back to Redline the following Monday, not to the day shift where she'd been humiliated, but to a newly created role reviewing inventory discrepancies across all 3 shifts. Benedict Cole had created the position specifically for her, said he wanted someone who already knew what it felt like to be dismissed, running point on making sure it never happened to anyone else quietly again. Sawyer Bennett got promoted too, though she never asked for it. Tierney Hollis recommended her for shift lead, citing the voicemail she'd kept without knowing why, the instinct that told her something was wrong months before any of us had proof. Sawyer told me later that she almost deleted that voicemail a dozen times. I'm glad every single time she didn't. The Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office confirmed 6 weeks later that they were pursuing charges against Zarek Dunmore, theft and falsification of business records among them. Percival Grant told me the resale evidence alone, 41 listings matched precisely against my notebook, made it one of the more thoroughly documented cases his office had seen in years. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard that. I felt tired in the good way, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot your shoulders could sit differently. Benedict Cole asked me, a few weeks into the new reporting system we built together, why I'd kept such careful records in the first place, long before I had any reason to suspect Zarek of anything. I told him about my mother, about the brass scale on her pantry shelf, about 30 years of ledgers logging every pound of flour that left that garage on Willowbend Street. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if Redline could make a donation to the pantry in her name. I said she would have liked that. Then I told him she'd have liked it more if he matched it every year instead of just once, and he laughed and he did exactly that. The sun had gone down by the time I got home from the office that evening. I hadn't noticed. My kitchen was dark except for the stove clock. 7:42. I stood there a long moment before I turned the light on, looking at my mother's scale on the shelf above the stove, still catching the last of the porch light through the window. I understood something standing there I hadn't understood the night Zarek said my name in that warehouse. The scale had never lied. I just needed enough proof stacked up to finally read it right. It's been almost a year now since that Thursday in the conference room, and I still keep a notebook in my back pocket, though these days it's mostly grocery lists and pantry inventory instead of discrepancy logs. Electo still runs the review process at Redline. Last I heard, she caught 2 more supervisors quietly padding their numbers before either of them got the chance to do what Zarek did to me. She calls me sometimes just to tell me the system's working, like she still can't quite believe it. Sawyer and I still volunteer together at the pantry every Saturday. She brought her nephew last month, 7 years old, and he spent the whole afternoon stacking canned goods according to some system only he understood, dead serious about it the way kids get when they've decided something matters. I watched him and thought about my mother teaching me the same kind of seriousness over her kitchen scale, 1 pound at a time. Benedict Cole still matches the pantry's funding every year, like he promised. He stopped by Willowbend Street once unannounced just to see it for himself. He didn't say much. He just stood by the folding table for a while, the way people do when a place is quieter and more honest than they expected. I think about Zarek sometimes, though not with the anger I once thought I'd carry. His trial is still working through the county court. Percival tells me the evidence is solid enough that it likely won't go much further than a plea. I don't need to watch him suffer to feel like something was finally set right. I never did. My mother taught me that a long time ago, though it took Zarek's whole ugly mess to teach me she was right. What I learned, if I'm honest, wasn't really about him at all. I was raised to keep quiet, to not make a fuss, to let things sort themselves out the way good people are supposed to trust they will. Nobody ever taught me what to do when the person telling me to stay quiet was the one doing something wrong. I had to learn that part on my own, one written down number at a time. A scale doesn't lie. It just waits for you to read it right. Here is the thing I wish someone had told me before any of this started. Love does not require you to lay down your own measurements. You are allowed to check. You are allowed to measure twice even when you want to believe. Especially when you want to believe. Because love that cannot survive a second measurement is not love. It is a loan you were never going to get back. I keep my mother's scale on the shelf above my stove still. Not because I need it to weigh anything anymore. Because it reminds me every single morning that the truth is usually sitting right there in plain sight. It just needs someone patient enough and honest enough to finally write it down. If you've ever been the one everyone expected to stay quiet, tell me about it. I read every comment. I understand more than you might think.